In the medieval world, shadows were not decoration. They were not accidents of light. They were believed to be evidence. Evidence that something unseen existed just beside you. Something thin, something patient, something that followed, even when it shouldn't. When the sun dipped low and candles were lit, people didn't just watch each other, they watched the walls. When light became suspicious. Medieval life was dim. Homes were lit by firelight, oil lamps, and thin candles that flickered with every breath of air. Shadows stretched long, bent unnaturally, and crawled across stone walls like living things. People were used to this. What they were not used to were shadows that behaved incorrectly. A shadow that leaned when the person stood still. A silhouette that lagged behind its owner by half a heartbeat. A shape that lifted its arm a moment after the body had already lowered it. These weren't ghost stories told for fun. They were recorded as warnings. The monk who watched himself leave. One of the earliest accounts comes from a monastery in Northern Europe. A monk, known only by his title, not his name, wrote of an evening prayer where he noticed something deeply unsettling. As he knelt before the wall, candle burning beside him, his shadow did not kneel. It remained standing. At first, he thought the flame had shifted. He adjusted the candle. The shadow did not move. He shifted his body. The shadow turned its head. The monk wrote that his blood felt cold but alert, as though his body recognized danger before his mind could accept it. He did not scream. He did not run. He finished the prayer with his eyes closed. When he opened them again, the shadow had returned to its proper place. He never prayed alone again. Shadows as moral mirrors. Medieval belief did not separate the physical from the spiritual. A shadow was thought to reflect not only your body, but your state of soul. Sermons warned that sinful men cast twisted shadows, that liars produced broken silhouettes, that those who lived double lives sometimes revealed it first on the wall. So when people noticed shadows behaving strangely, they didn't ask how. They asked why. What had the person done? What had followed them home? What part of them had stepped slightly out of alignment? The Market Woman and the Late Shadow. In one town chronicle, a market woman was accused, not of theft, but of shadow delay. Witnesses claimed her shadow arrived a second late at dusk, sliding into place after she had already stopped moving. The accusation spread quietly. No one confronted her directly. Instead, people stopped standing near her at sunset, stopped sharing candles, stopped letting their children walk beside her. She was never charged, never punished. She simply faded from records, as if removing the person was easier than confronting the shadow. Why night made it worse. During the day, shadows behaved predictably, but night introduced fire, and fire does not cast honest shapes. Flames dance, they hesitate, they flicker sideways, and yet people learned the difference between normal flicker and something else. A shadow that pulses in rhythm with breath, a silhouette that sharpens when no light changes, a dark shape that seems to wait when the person leaves the room. At night, shadows became listeners. The unspoken rule. There was an unspoken medieval rule. If you notice your shadow behaving incorrectly, you do not mention it. Speaking of it was believed to invite separation. as if acknowledging the difference gave the shadow permission to become something more than reflection. So people learned to walk carefully at dusk, to avoid bright firelight, to stand close to walls only when necessary, and most importantly, to never look too closely at their own silhouette when they were alone. This is only the beginning, because not all shadows were attached to their owners, and not all of them waited for permission to move. In medieval towns, people learned to trust certain rhythms. Footsteps echoed before a person appeared. Voices arrived with bodies, not before them. And shadows were meant to follow. So when shadows began arriving first, it unsettled something very old in the human mind. The alley that announced visitors. There was an alley in a river town, narrow, damp, and rarely used except at dusk. Merchants claimed they could see shadows spill across its stones before anyone turned the corner. Long, thin silhouettes would stretch across the wall, pause, and then wait. A moment later, sometimes several heartbeats later, the person would appear. At first, people laughed it off. The angle of the sun, they said, the way light bends near water. But the shadows were too accurate. They carried hats. They showed walking staffs. They even revealed limps, details visible before the body confirmed them. And sometimes, no one followed at all. The shadow without an owner. Several witnesses described the same thing. A shadow would arrive, linger, and then retreat, sliding backward into nothing. No footsteps, no figure, no sound. Just the unmistakable outline of a human shape behaving as if it had made a mistake. The alley was avoided after that. People took longer routes. Children were warned not to run ahead of their parents at sunset. Because the idea settled in quietly, some shadows were scouting. The scholar who measured light. Not everyone accepted fear so easily. A traveling scholar, one of the rare few, attempted to explain the phenomenon. He placed candles, measured angles, marked the wall with charcoal. He waited for shadows to arrive early. They didn't. Instead, something else happened. His own shadow arrived late. He wrote that it appeared stretched, slightly misaligned, as if the wall rejected it at first. The scholar packed his things the next morning and never returned to the town. His notes ended mid-sentence. When doors began to react. In several homes, doors creaked open not when people arrived, but when their shadows touched the threshold. This was deeply unsettling. Doors, after all, were thought to recognize intent. They protected, they separated inside from outside. A shadow triggering a door suggested something else entirely. That shadows could carry presence, weight, authority. That they were not just signs of arrival, but participants. The firelight test. People developed quiet methods of reassurance. They would step into firelight deliberately, watching carefully. Did the shadow form instantly? Did it hesitate? Did it sharpen too much? If anything felt wrong, they would extinguish the flame immediately. Better darkness than an incorrect reflection. In some homes, fires were kept deliberately low, not for warmth, for safety. The shadow that entered first. One account describes a man returning late at night. As he approached his cottage, he saw his shadow already cast on the wall inside. The door was still closed. He did not enter. He slept in the barn instead. By morning, the shadow was gone. Nothing disturbed, nothing stolen. But from that day on, he refused to stand near walls at night and never lit a candle unless someone else was in the room. What people began to suspect, slowly, carefully, without ever saying it directly, people began to suspect something unsettling. That shadows were not attached to bodies, but assigned to them. That most shadows behaved, followed rules, stayed behind, and that the ones that arrived early were simply impatient. In medieval belief, a shadow was expected to be loyal. It followed you into rooms. It waited when you stopped. And when you left, it left with you. So when shadows began to stay behind, people didn't panic immediately. They froze. Because this was not fear. This was violation. The shadow left on the wall. One of the most repeated accounts comes from a farmhouse near a crossroads. A man entered his home at dusk, lit a candle, and hung his cloak. His shadow stretched tall across the wall beside the hearth. Then he stepped into the next room. The shadow did not follow. It remained exactly where it was, pressed against the stone, perfectly shaped, as if still expecting him to return. At first, he assumed the candle flickered. He shifted the flame. The shadow stayed. He moved closer. The shadow sharpened. Not darker, clearer. He extinguished the candle and sat in darkness until morning. When absence became the problem. People often fear sudden appearances, but medieval accounts suggest something else frightened them more: persistence. A shadow that stayed too long, a silhouette that remained after the body was gone, a dark shape that seemed to be waiting for something unfinished. In inns, guests complained of shadows lingering on walls long after their owners had gone to sleep. In churches, shadows clung to pillars after evening prayer, as if reluctant to leave sacred ground. No one accused the shadows of malice. That would have been easier. Instead, they were described as unresolved. The child who wouldn't look back. A small village record tells of a child sent to fetch water at dusk. When she returned, her mother noticed something wrong. The child's shadow trailed behind her, not physically, but emotionally. It clung too close to the ground. Its movements were sluggish, as if tired. When asked about it, the child said only one thing: it wanted to stay near the well. She was never sent alone again. The well was sealed later that year, though no one admitted why. Shadows and places. Over time, people noticed a pattern. Shadows that refused to leave were often tied to specific locations: thresholds, corners, doorways, stairs, places of transition. Medieval thinkers believed these were weak points, spaces where one state of being shifted into another. Inside to outside, light to dark, waking to sleep. A shadow lingering there felt like something caught mid-change, not finished becoming what it was supposed to be. The candle trick. People developed quiet tests. One was simple: light a candle, step forward, then step back suddenly. If the shadow followed smoothly, all was well. If it hesitated, even for a breath, the flame was snuffed out immediately. Some homes stopped using wall-mounted candles entirely. They preferred lanterns, which moved with the body. They wanted shadows that traveled. One account describes a woman who noticed her shadow no longer mirrored her posture. When she sat, it stood. When she lay down, it leaned. Eventually, she realized something worse. The shadow was angled toward the door, always, as if paying attention to sounds she could not hear, as if waiting for someone else to arrive. She began sleeping facing the wall instead, not to avoid the shadow, but to avoid seeing what it might react to. what was never written down. Most of these accounts end abruptly. No explanation, no resolution, no warning. Just a final note. After this, we no longer stayed late. After this, we avoided the room. After this, we changed the way we lit our homes. Because medieval people understood something instinctively. A shadow that refuses to leave is not lost. It is choosing. And whatever it is choosing to stay for is not finished yet. Shadows were meant to belong, to mirror one body, to answer one movement, to remain loyal to a single source of light. So when medieval accounts began describing shadows that appeared to be watching someone else, not their owner, the unease deepened into something colder. This was no longer misalignment. This was a tension. The shadow facing the wrong direction. In a small chapel, a man knelt in prayer beside his brother. Two bodies, two candles, two shadows stretched across the wall. Except one of them didn't match. One shadow faced the altar. The other faced his brother. Not angled, not partially turned, fully oriented, as if observing. The man shifted. His shadow shifted with him. His brother shifted. The shadow did not. After prayers ended, the brothers left without speaking. Neither returned to that chapel again. The market incident. In a crowded marketplace, movement was constant. Bodies passed, shadows overlapped. No one paid close attention, until someone did. A woman noticed her shadow leaning toward a stranger as he passed, its edge stretching longer, thinner, reaching. She stopped. The stranger stopped too. Their shadows touched first. Both pulled away instantly. Nothing else happened. No sound, no reaction. But the woman left the market early, and the stranger was never seen there again. Shadows that followed the wrong person. Several records describe shadows that appeared to detach socially. A man would walk with a group only to notice his shadow drifting towards someone else, not physically separating, but angling, sliding, as if curious. People didn't accuse shadows of chasing, they used gentler words. Lingering, favoring, taking interest. That language mattered. It suggested choice. The children's game that stopped being funny. Children noticed before adults did. They played games at dusk, running, jumping, laughing. One game involved racing shadows along the wall. Until one child noticed something strange. His shadow reached another child first, before he did. Then it waited. The children went quiet. No one laughed. No one explained. The game was never played again. When shadows showed preference. In households, people began noticing patterns. A shadow that always leaned toward the sick, one that sharpened near the grieving, another that seemed restless around certain visitors. No one said the shadows caused anything, but people noticed. The ones whose shadows attracted attention often left first, not by death, by departure. They moved away, married suddenly, joined monasteries, took roads without saying goodbye, as if something had made them uncomfortable in their own light. The rule of polite ignorance. The unspoken rule returned. Do not comment, do not react, do not acknowledge. Looking directly at a misbehaving shadow, especially one focused on someone else, was believed to invite escalation. So people trained themselves to look away, to focus on hands, on floors, on candle flames, anything but the wall. The question everyone avoided, A final question haunted these accounts. If shadows can watch other people, what are they learning? And worse, what happens when they decide they've learned enough? By now, people had learned something important. Shadows were not random. They noticed patterns. They remembered. And sometimes, they knew things their owners did not. The shadow that reacted first. Several accounts describe the same unsettling sequence. A person would be standing calmly, speaking, listening, or simply waiting. Their shadow would change first. It would stiffen, sharpen, lean. Only moments later would the person feel it. A sudden chill, a sense of being watched, the instinct to turn. By then, the shadow already knew. This reversal terrified medieval observers. It suggested shadows were not passive reflections, but early warning systems for something the body had not yet sensed. The confession that never happened. In one monastery, a brother prepared to confess something he had hidden for years. He entered the chamber alone, lit a single candle. As he spoke the first words, his shadow did something unexpected. It bowed. Not slumped, not flickered, bowed. The brother fell silent. He never finished the confession, never returned to the chamber, never explained what he had intended to say. But after that night, he avoided firelight entirely. Shadows and secrets. People began whispering that shadows heard thoughts before words, that they registered intention, guilt, regret, things that existed before sound. This led to a strange fear, not of being overheard, but of being understood. Some believed shadows stored what they learned, like dark libraries pressed against walls. The longer a shadow stayed with you, the more it knew. The house that refused visitors. A particular house gained a reputation. Visitors claimed their shadows behaved oddly inside, thickening, stretching, pressing against corners. Conversations felt heavier there. Words came slower. People forgot what they were saying mid-sentence. The owners eventually stopped inviting guests, not out of rudeness, but out of courtesy. No one wanted those shadows learning more than necessary. When shadows began to anticipate. The most disturbing accounts describe shadows that moved as if expecting something. A man would reach for a cup, the shadow's hand lifted first. A woman would turn, the silhouette already leaned, not reacting, predicting. This created a terrifying possibility that shadows were not just learning from humans, but practicing. The silent agreement. Over time, people adapted. They limited candlelight. They avoided standing still too long. They moved deliberately, predictably, without hesitation. They believed confusion attracted attention. Clarity kept shadows obedient. And so medieval life developed a strange undercurrent of control. Walk with purpose, speak with certainty, do not linger in half-decisions, because uncertainty, it was said, gave shadows room to think. What was left unasked? No one dared ask the final question. If shadows know our secrets, anticipate our movements, and react before we do, who is truly leading whom? And if the answer ever changed, would we be the first to notice? For a long time, people believed that even misbehaving shadows were still attached. Wrong, distorted, disobedient, but attached. Then came the accounts that changed everything. Accounts where shadows did not merely lag or linger, they pulled away. The stretch that didn't end. It began subtly. A shadow would stretch farther than expected, its edges thinning, its shape elongating beyond the reach of the body that cast it. At first, this was dismissed as poor light. But then people noticed something else. When the body stepped back, the shadow did not fully return. It remained extended, like a hand still reaching after being refused. The gap. Witnesses described a moment, terrifying in its simplicity, when a small space appeared between foot and shadow. Not much, the width of a finger, a breath of darkness, enough to notice, enough to panic, enough to confirm something no one wanted to believe. The shadow was no longer fully bound. The man who stepped away first. One account tells of a man standing by his hearth. He shifted his weight. His shadow didn't follow. Instead, it remained fixed, facing him. The man took another step. The gap widened. They stood there, man and shadow, separated by a thin, trembling distance. After a long moment, the man stepped back into alignment. The shadow accepted him. But from that night on, he refused to stand still near walls. Shadows testing balance. People began noticing patterns. Shadows separated most often when someone hesitated, paused mid-thought, stopped halfway through a decision. It was as if uncertainty loosened the bond. The shadow didn't flee, it tested, like a tether stretched just enough to see if it would snap. The fear of reversal. The greatest fear wasn't separation, it was replacement. People wondered, if a shadow can step away from us, could it step into us? This fear remained unspoken, but it shaped behavior. People avoided standing between multiple light sources. They avoided twilight. They avoided moments when identity felt thin. The first quiet rule change. A new rule spread, quietly. Never turn your back on your shadow if it feels heavy. If separation begins, do not move forward. Step back, rejoin, reassert. Because no one knew what happened to shadows that completed the separation, and no one wanted to find out which side would be left standing. The tension that remained. After these accounts, people didn't sleep the same way. They positioned beds away from walls. They covered reflective surfaces. They kept light sources low and steady. Not to avoid shadows, but to keep them close. Because distance, they believed, invited curiosity. And curiosity, in something that learns, is never harmless. By this point, people no longer believed shadows were passive. They watched, they waited, they learned, and sometimes they suggested. The step taken first. There are accounts of people noticing their shadow move before they did. Not by much, a slight shift, a foot angled toward a doorway, a lean toward a corridor. Enough to notice only if you were already afraid. Some followed without realizing, others froze, heart racing, as their shadow seemed to indicate a direction they had not chosen. The pull of familiar places. Shadows rarely pointed toward danger. That was what made them convincing. They led people toward kitchens, toward beds, toward paths they had walked 1,000 times. Safety disguised as routine. People said the shadow knew where you felt most yourself, where your guard was lowest, where you would stop questioning. The delay. Not everyone followed immediately. Those who resisted described a strange sensation, a heaviness in the chest, a pressure behind the eyes. like standing at the edge of a forgotten thought. The shadow didn't force. It waited. Waiting, it seemed, was one of the things shadows had always been good at. When people let themselves be led. Some did follow. They walked slowly, as if sleepwalking, keeping their eyes on the floor, tracking the dark shape just ahead of their feet. Nothing dramatic happened. They arrived somewhere ordinary. A doorway, a chair, a window. But afterward, they could not explain why they had gone there at all, only that it felt necessary. The fear of habit. This is where fear deepened. Because if shadows could guide us through habit, through comfort, through familiarity, then resistance required constant awareness. And awareness, people learned, is exhausting. The near-ending realization. By now, most believed the truth was not that shadows wished to replace us. It was worse. They wanted to share, to walk just ahead, to take the first step while we followed, thinking it was our own idea. Where we leave it. And so we pause here, not at an ending, but at a quiet understanding. Shadows no longer lag behind. They no longer merely copy. They anticipate. They suggest. They wait for us to agree, not with words, but with movement. And tonight, as you lie still, you might notice something comforting. Your shadow is close, still attached, still patient. For now. At some point, someone finally looked back. Not quickly, not in panic, but slowly, with the careful courage of a person ready to see whatever had always been there. Medieval accounts rarely describe the act itself, only the result. A man pauses in a corridor. A woman stops at the threshold of her home. A child turns mid-step, sunlight frozen at their feet. They look back, and for the first time, the shadow does not follow. It waits. Witnesses said the shadow blurred, its edges uncertain, as if unsure how to behave when directly observed. It was still familiar, still shaped like them, but thinner, less confident, almost shy. For a long moment, nothing moved. This was not a confrontation. There was no scream, no collapse, no miracle, only stillness. The person and the shadow shared a silence so complete that even thought seemed to soften. In that pause, people later said, they felt something loosen. To look back was not an act of dominance, it was recognition. Not, you are mine, but I see you. And in being seen, the shadow lost its urgency. It no longer leaned forward, no longer suggested, no longer pulled. It returned to its place. Life did not change dramatically. People went on walking, cooking, sleeping, growing old. But afterward, shadows behaved. They stayed behind. They moved when their owners moved. They no longer rushed ahead, not because they were defeated, but because they were acknowledged. No chronicler made a law of it. No church declared a doctrine. No scholar formalized the rule. But quietly, people learned. If something follows you too closely, sometimes the answer is not to run. It is to stop and look back. Tonight, your shadow lies where it should, resting, attached, still. It will follow you into sleep, stretch along the walls, soften in the dark. And if, in a half-dream, you feel it shift, remember, you know how this story ends. You can always look back. And when you do, the shadow will remember where it belongs. Sleep now. The light is low. Nothing is chasing you.